Have you?
We have the honor today of being joined by Tyler Goens, who is a pastor at River Valley and I hear a soccer coach. Where else can we find you out and about in the community, Tyler?
You might see me running around. I'm training for Boston, so going to Boston in April.
Yes.
I'm pretty excited about that.
Yes. That's a lot of running around.
It is, yeah.
Nice. Any other little nooks and crannies? I do know that we could find you in a doctor's office later today getting
That's right.
ultrasound for a little one who is coming soon.
Yeah, maybe by the time this thing comes out, the baby will be
There
out.
will be a baby that's out too.
So
congratulations
thank you.
on that.
Yep, we're really
Yes.
excited. We're having a little girl, our first one.
Yes.
First grandbaby on both sides too,
Oh,
so it's a big deal.
Much anticipated baby.
Totally.
How fun. That will be really exciting.
Yeah.
I'm excited for you guys.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for joining with us today. I know that we've connected in the past a little bit on different matters with racism and talking about that. And so I know that racism matters to you. And I've often found that people have stories around why racism matters to them. And I look forward to getting to hear some of your own stories. So let's start with that. Why does racism matter to you, Tyler?
Yeah, when you sent over those questions, that was the one that was like, oh wow, this is the hardest one. You know, like why does this matter? Why is this important? And I guess like at an intellectual level, it's the idea of just how complex the issue is. Like you've used the illustration of like an onion. I mean, there's just so many different perspectives and opinions and values on this and different understandings. I mean, try to find one definition of the word racism. It's difficult, you know? And so like at some level, I just wanted some clarity on, and still do. I mean, I don't have this all figured out at all. I was hoping you do. That's why I'm here, you know? But so just at one level, it's like, oh, let's have a proper understanding what's going on so we like can know how to have a solution, you know? So just accurately naming what's actually going on, what's happening, understanding different people's experiences. But then, I mean, just the corrosiveness of racism is how cancerous it is. Just the animosity, the hostility, and how, just corrosive that is in relationships, in a community. So, I remember as a little kid getting to go to Mexico for the first time with my dad. I think I was 7 years old. We went on a missions trip, and I don't know if you'd call it maybe if it was a racial barrier or a class barrier or just poverty or whatever, but I did not want to play with the kids. I just had this kind of hostility, this resentment, this distance between me and them. And that was maybe my first experience personally of like, I mean, Grants Pass in the 90s was probably 94% white. So this was kind of my first experience with another culture, I guess. And since then, I've been to Mexico over 20 times. I minored in Spanish. I mean, just have such a great, appreciation for the Hispanic community. And but that was maybe my first experience of like with some diversity from a very not diverse community. Mm-hmm. But yeah, those are just maybe a couple things that come to mind. I know God's heart is not for hostility or animosity or any kind of division, and that his heart is for reconciliation and restoration. So maybe those are a couple things that come to mind on why this matters to me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
I love getting to soak it up. Now, you mentioned growing up in Grants Pass. When you were growing up here, did you have any experiences of witnessing racism happening, or knowing that it was only, what would that be, 6% people of color in our community? But
right.
Yeah, any stories there?
Not really, and I'm probably the wrong person to ask, obviously, in terms of experiencing or seeing racism. There was or has been the occasional, typically older people that are maybe more entrenched in a more racist mindset. Like you see that every so often. whether it be as a pastor or community member. But I'd say, generally speaking, it's more of a racial insensitivity. And that might manifest in, certain jokes or stereotypes, comments, things like that. So that's kind of my vantage point on what I've seen. But not a ton of like explicit racism. Although I have friends who have experienced it more blatantly.
Yeah. That word racial insensitivity is one that you've mentioned before, and I've noticed that. That's something I'm gonna log. I think that's helpful language for me as I move about and interact. That's helpful. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Well, it's a little difficult because words and phrases, they change. They become more offensive sometimes. And, there's kind of this, maybe on the right, the idea of like being politically correct and how there's kind of a backlash against that. And so I'm sensitive to people who say, well, things change so fast. I don't know what the right word is to use or what word's offensive or not. And there is kind of maybe in academia and in bigger cities, there's maybe more of you're more in tune with the right words to use and not. And so I'm sensitive to those who are a little older, who aren't as plugged in with trends and with culture, that are like, I can't keep up, and so I understand that too. So I try and understand both sides, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you. Now I know you recently preached a sermon on racism.
What was I thinking?
I know. Good grief. And that River Valley has how many campuses?
We just started a Sunny Valley campus, so now we're at 5.
Okay, so 5 campuses. And all of those campuses preached a sermon on race because you were kind of following a
4 of them
process?
did. Sunny Valley hadn't started yet.
Okay, yeah. So why do you think it's relevant to talk about racism in Grants Pass today?
In terms of that series that we did at our church, we were really trying to address just a lot of the, we called it biblical clarity in cultural chaos. So just a lot of the things that we see around us, the craziness, the chaos, just wanting to name what's happening. And so we talked about all sorts of things, all sorts of hot button issues. And we're like, if we ignore the race topic, that's not great. It's a blind spot. It's something we need to talk about. So that was in the context of that series that we were going through. But remind me of your question.
Yeah, just why is it relevant to talk about it today? One of my own experiences is there are people that one of the first things they want to say, but what does it have to do with us? What does it have to do with today? Like we've talked about these things in the past. Why today? So yeah, why today?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think of is like history does impact us. And so like, there's also sorts of people doing ancestry.com and DNA tests because we want to have some sort of connection with the past. And we do recognize that at some level we are connected with those before us. Like I am an individual, but there's also, a connection with the past and good things that have been handed down to me, legacies that have been handed down, and also negative things. And so, when you just read about maybe some of the history of racism in Grants Pass, I don't know what impact that has on today, but I know that there is an impact. And so I just want to better understand what that impact is, because I do think it's latent. It's kind of maybe in the bones, but there is an impact. But I also think that in a city that's now, I checked on Wikipedia this morning, I think we're 90 or 89% white. Just how can we, as the dominant community, the dominant, racial community, how can we have a better awareness and understanding of how those who are different, how they feel here in this place? So I think that's maybe why it's important to talk about it.
Thank you. You've touched on this a bit, but I'd love to kind of bring it to the forefront a bit. What's your perception of our community today in regards to racism?
Yeah, it's hard to disentangle sometimes from like the national conversation, unfortunately, with just how often it gets really politicized, you know. So, you know, some people think that it doesn't exist and they ignore it. Other people see racism everywhere and in everyone and kind of replaces the Christian doctrine of original sin, you know. Like instead of, as Christians, we teach that kind of everyone is a sinner and we all need God's grace. There's almost a sense in some anti-racist circles that everyone's a racist all the time, you know, and so I think those two extremes are unhealthy, and I do see that locally too, where those two extremes, we are a more conservative community, so the circles I run in, it's a little bit more, hey, it's not an issue, we don't need to talk about it, it's not a problem, but maybe with younger people, you run into maybe a little bit more of that other side. So again, back to the clarity thing, I just think we need a lot more understanding, like what's really going on and how can we do a better job listening to each other and moving forward.
Thank you. Now, because I know you've preached a sermon on racism, and because you come from that perspective of you're a scholar and a biblical scholar in a lot of ways, what is your perspective of what the Bible has to say about racism?
You might have done more research on that term racism and that category, how in some ways that's kind of a modern category that comes out of the transatlantic slave trade. And but in terms of like prejudice against other ethnic groups, I mean, we see that all throughout human history where one tribe enslaves, beats up, kills the other tribe, you know, just the animosity. So I think the Bible has a lot to say about, reconciliation more generally, but, racial and ethnic reconciliation too. I mean, I think of in the Old Testament, God's heart for the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, the immigrant. In the ancient world, typically the gods identified with the kings, the elite, those in power. But the God of Israel identifies with the alien, the immigrant, the orphan, the widow. And so I think that's significant. You know, in Leviticus, everyone's favorite book of the Bible, is where we read, "Love your neighbor as yourself." If that's not the foundation for racial reconciliation, I don't know what is. Some people think Jesus said it. He actually takes it out of Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself. So I think that's a huge thing biblically. God has a lot to say about the state of our heart. Like, hey, are we harboring bitterness and resentment and animosity, anger, hostility? Like those are things to take really seriously. How we treat those who are different from us. James has a lot to say about favoritism, especially in like the church context. Like, are you treating the rich and the powerful person more, giving them the best seats in the room, and the poor person, you're like, hey, go sit in the back, go sit in the smoking section, and so there's just a lot in Scripture. And then, like you see with Jesus, he's interacting with Samaritans, he's interacting with Romans, and he's seen past their ethnic category and seeing them as an individual and as a person, crossing all sorts of cultural and racial lines to have relationships with those kinds of people. And there's all sorts of backstory on the Samaritans or the Romans and why the Jews had all sorts of reasons to be very resentful against those people. But Jesus somehow didn't carry those resentments like everyone else did.
Thank you. Now, whether it's been in the process of the sermon prep that you really dug into or just everyday life, and I know we've kind of touched on this again, but just to bring it to the forefront, what has been your experience of talking about racism in Grants Pass?
Yeah, so I think with people who are really partisan, not good. So if you're very locked into one side or the other, you kind of are a robot. Like it's hard to have a conversation with you. But I do find a lot of people are interested in talking about this conversation, especially young people. Although sometimes older people are open-minded and young people are fundamentalists too, on the right and the left. But I find that people are maybe more interested in having the conversation than we'd think. And so I've just been encouraged by it is usually younger people though willing to have a more substantial conversation about it.
I think you probably touched in on this, if you have any thoughts on why that's been your experience. But any other things to add on that?
Well, it's funny, so Gen Z gets beat up on a lot, or like a lot of people are like those millennials these days. And I'm like, millennials are like grandparents now, like they're like 40, 50, 60. And so okay, Gen Zers, and, a lot of people beat up on the younger generation. They've been doing that since Socrates. But I found that Gen Z students are usually a lot more, they're a lot more open-minded, and sometimes that can be to a fault, but they're also a lot more able to have these kinds of conversations too sometimes. So I think there is a lot of, the Gen Zers have a lot more empathy. And so there's sometimes it's easier to build bridges there. Yeah. It's like we were talking about before the podcast, truth and love. And, that they're really strong on the love and on the love piece. And I think there's ways to build bridges there and bring the truth into that.
Thank you. So I know that you're a reader, and that's like an understatement.
Yeah, you're a reader too. You dropped 4 books off at my office.
Yeah, but it took me like years to get through all those books. I don't know how fast you get through books, but you were definitely in another category. So in this process, have you found any resources, whether it's books or otherwise, that have been helpful or meaningful to you as you're this process of seeking to understand racism or potential ways forward to healing and reconciliation?
I think everybody should talk to Gabby Johnson about this issue, because they'll be encouraged. And so that would be my first recommendation for anyone. That's her, by the way. And I really appreciated the book or pamphlet that you put together on just the history of racism in Grants Pass. Very eye-opening. And I think the thing about history is you can't argue with it. It either happened or it didn't. And so it's like, oh, this is eye-opening, So I think you're a great resource, and I've learned a lot from you.
Thank you.
3 books that come to mind: Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And, oh man, so I think I believe in the death penalty in principle, but in practice, his book shows how it's often a lot of people who maybe were innocent have been killed by the death penalty. Yeah. Disproportionately African Americans. And so that book was very moving and eye-opening. Just that book kind of gets to your heart, I think. Intellectually, the book Beyond Racial Division by George Yancey, I think I recommended that one to you. That one really helped me understand kind of the 2 extremes of maybe colorblindness, where, hey, let's just ignore racial problems, and then kind of an extreme anti-racist view, which would be like, let's kind of beat everyone into submission with our viewpoint on this issue, and just kind of yell at everybody. And then he kind of charts a middle way, mutual accountability in conversations and stuff. And then the last one, I read it right when George Floyd was killed, because I'm just like, I just need some bearings, I need to figure out what's going on, was Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise. And that was very eye-opening. I don't know that I would endorse all of his work, but that book for me was really helpful in understanding just some of the history of what's happened and how the church has dropped the ball in a lot of ways. And as a Christian pastor, that means a lot to me, knowing hey, how the church has done poorly in this area. And, some people in the church led the way towards abolition and stuff. But anyway, those would be the 4 books with your book that I would recommend to people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you shared in there how those have been helpful and meaningful. Is there any other things you want to bring up in how they've been helpful and meaningful in your process?
I mean, I've mentioned a couple times already the idea of history and but when the stories are told, we can know information and stats and 27% of this and 100%, you're just like, blah, blah, blah. Statistics are not that moving. But when you hear a story, especially when in terms of violence or lynching or it's very overwhelming. And, so reading those stories, and I know they can be used manipulatively, but they happen too. And so I just think that really kind of moves it to another level. And it registers. And I'm not a very emotional person, but it kind of registers on an emotional level when you read some of those things.
Yeah.
Read about our past.
Yeah. There's a connecting that I think happens
For
as
sure.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So one of the things with Grant's Pass Remembrance that we tend to talk about is becoming a sunrise community. And this would be like the opposite of a sundown town.
Sure.
So when you think about sunrise community, what do you think a sunrise community would look like?
I don't know. I think, we could use cliches or words like I would hope it would be more welcoming and more hospitable. As a church leader, I hope our church can be a hospitable place to those who aren't in the majority community, I just can't imagine what it would be like to not be white in this community. And so, what does it look like for us to be more open, more welcoming? Hopefully more people just more interested in newcomers. Like, hey, tell me your story. How'd you get here? Because it's always fascinating, even with people who look like me. Just, hey, how did you get to Grants Pass? Because most of us came from California, but what part? So I don't know. Maybe just more better questions, more meals around tables. Inviting, just being a more inviting, welcoming place, I guess.
Thank you. One of the things that I think is a characteristic of things that are the opposite of racism is a value or a love of diversity, or even a desire to see that flourish. And so I'm kind of hopping out there in asking this question, but the question I want to ask is, what do you love about diversity? And I'm assuming that diversity is something that there might be an enjoyment of, but
we need things that'll bring us together, right? We need common bonds and things that we share. Like, we can't have 100% diversity. I don't mean that like ethnically, but just we have to have some things that bring us together and bond us as a community. But we can also get stale. And so, like, I don't know, every time I've experienced new places or gone on missions trips or talked to new, different, interesting people, there's always just an expanding of my mind, my experiences. There's just a richness, a flavor, I think diversity just adds, just another level of, I can't think of a better word than it's just more interesting. Life's a lot more interesting when you talk with interesting people who aren't like me. I don't know if that's a good answer, but I just think it's easy to get stuck in our cocoons, echo chambers, and but it's also every time I've gone other places, I've been really encouraged, and God's taught me things through people that were very different from me.
And I think you mentioned something about a good answer. Any answer is a good answer. I love hearing the different ways that people put things or the different things that they bring out. Yes, thank you. And you did kind of touch on this, but just in case it rises something else to the surface, why do you think diversity is important?
Because we get stuck, we get insulated. Again, community is good, but the dark side of community would be like tribalism. And so if we're held together by common love, I think this was a David Brooks thing, held together by common love, that's community. But held together by common animosity, that would be like a tribalism.
Oh, interesting.
And it's really easy to, I remember 7-year-old me in Mexico, is that with that maybe a level of animosity towards the Mexican kids that I didn't want to play with. Yeah. It's because I didn't know them. I had no exposure to people that were different from me. And then as I got to know him, as we started kicking the ball around and started playing soccer, there's this bond, this connection. Oh, we both love soccer. You too? I thought I was the only one. And then there's this connection formed. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, we've talked about some of the pieces of brokenness in our community, but let's talk about some of the beautiful. And there's lots of broken and beautiful history that we have. But for you today, right now, what do you love about Grants Pass?
Yeah, I guess maybe people could interpret some of the things we've said, like we don't love this community, or that there's a lot wrong with it. But I mean, I love living here. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. Like you said, we're having a baby and bringing life into this community. So yeah, I love the people here. Yeah. I love our church community. I love the Four Seasons. This fall's felt a little weird, kind of warm, but I love how it's like a small town, but we still have a mod pizza, just stuff like that where it's, and I grew up here. So there's just, it feels like a small town to me in all the best ways. Yeah.
Small town was new for me, but I love it. I love it. I'm a total convert to small towns.
Totally. And sometimes like if you're in the store and you're like trying to get in and out and you see people that you're like, oh, dang it. Like I'm trying to get out of here. But it is a cool thing too, where it's like, hey, how you doing?
Definitely. Is there anything else that you didn't get a chance to share? I didn't ask, or that's still kind of lingering that you'd like to share on this topic?
I don't think so. I mean, just the idea that Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be called children of God. So when we make peace, when there's reconciliation, that's very godlike. And I've told you this before, but I'll say it publicly. You are very much a peacemaker. And, I love the work that you're doing and totally supportive of you. So thank you so much for all that you're doing and the conversations you're having, the spaces that you're in. It just seems really important, and I can't think of anyone better to do it.
Thank you so much, Tyler. It has been an honor to sit with you, and thank you for honoring me.
Oh, of course, yeah.
That's just a real gift. Now, for those of you that are listening to this and have listened to this, I'd like to invite you to ask yourself a couple questions. First one being, what did you notice? What stood out? What of what Tyler said, or what of what came up today stood out to you? And notice that, sit with that, wonder about it. Maybe invite a friend to wonder with you. If you want, by golly, send us an email at Grants Pass Remembrance and invite us into wondering with you. But
if it's an angry email, send it to Gabby.
Yes. Well, lucky for them, I answer
Trevor.
all the emails at Grants Pass Remembrance. So you can give me an angry email, or a joyful one, or a apathetic one, whatever it is. That's welcomed. We are honored to get to connect with community members. It's been an honor to get to connect with you today, Tyler, and to hear you share. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm so excited for you to get to go see your baby.
Thank you.
Who will be very soon joining you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Thank you.